QSO Today, episode 423, David Trachtenberg, N4WWL. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest amateur radios and accessories for your ham radio station, and by Nuts and Volts magazine. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic our amateur radio hobby continues to be. David Trachtenberg, N4WWL's ham radio journey, started with shortwave listening as a young teen growing up on the East Coast, and once licensed, matured to operating Air Force Mars in the service of his hobby and country. David appreciates the variety of new equipment and technology as well as making new friends on the air. N4WWL is my QSO today. N4WWL, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, David?
4Z1UG. This is N4WWL. Good day, Eric.
Good day, David. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Oh, absolutely. I would say my path to amateur radio took perhaps somewhat of a circuitous route. I didn't get started in ham radio at an early age, but I did get started in listening to shortwave radio at an early age. I would guess that many of your listeners, if they're sort of my age, I kind of grew up in the 60s and 70s, may have gotten their start by listening to shortwave radio. I started out as a teenager. A friend of mine actually introduced me to the world of shortwave radio. I was probably around 13 years of age or so. He introduced me to the hobby. And for me, it was just fascinating to hear broadcasts from other countries in their native languages as well as in English. It helped me learn about other cultures, and it also sparked my interest in foreign languages.
Did you have any favorite foreign broadcast stations?
Sure, that's a very good question. I remember I spent a lot of time, actually, believe it or not, listening to the Voice of America in the 1970s. I remember I would sit in my room in the evenings at 7 o'clock at night and listen to a program, listen to their broadcast in what was called Special English. And there were several shows that I enjoyed. One was called The Making of a Nation, in which they basically had various episodes about American history and the evolution of American history. I sort of learned more about American history from listening to VOA's The Making of a Nation than I think I ever learned in history class. I also sort of garnered an appreciation for jazz by listening to Willis Conover, his jazz hour on VOA. But in terms of foreign broadcasts, I always enjoyed listening to stations like Radio Moscow, for example, just to hear some of the odd perspectives, or different perspectives, I should say, of some of those other countries. Many of the European stations came in really well. I remember listening to Swiss Radio International, and of course, the BBC was always one of my favorites. During one of my trips to London, I paid a visit to the BBC headquarters there, and that was pretty enjoyable to me. I did the same thing on a trip to Canada. I located the studios of Radio Canada International and paid them a bit of a visit. So, for me, shortwave was really what sparked my interest generally in international affairs.
Were you a collector of QSL cards?
I was indeed. I have all my QSL cards from 1970 on. I still have them in my collection. The first QSL card that I ever received was from Radio Nederland in Holland. and that was followed by a QSL card from the VOA, their relay station, two of them actually, one of their relay stations in Monrovia, Liberia, and another in Tangier, Morocco. And then the QSL cards started to pile in. Occasionally I go back. In fact, I have one here. I have a little bit of Ukrainian ancestry, and with everything that's going on in the world today, I went back and I pulled out my my old QSL card from Radio Kiev, which I sort of have on display here in my shack.
And would you say that if you were looking at all of your old QSL cards, what do you think is the most unusual or maybe the most valuable to you?
I think some of the QSL cards from Radio Japan were actually beautiful. I enjoyed some of the QSL cards from Radio Prague, and Radio Australia, I thought, had some really interesting QSL cards. One of the QSL cards I have from Radio Australia has got a picture of the kookaburra bird on there. And of course, that was a part of Radio Australia's interval signal for many, many years. They would play Waltzing Matilda followed by the call of the kookaburra bird. And I just thought that was fascinating.
I noticed in your QRZ picture, you have a picture of your station, and we can talk a little bit more about that later. But I did notice that you actually still have a couple of general coverage receivers for shortwave listening. Are you still a shortwave listener?
I am when I have the time, Eric. I do enjoy doing that. Some of the general coverage receivers I have, the first one I had, which I still have, in fact, was a Yaesu FRG 7700. And in fact, I have two of those general coverage receivers. I always thought that was an excellent general coverage receiver. For a while, I actually had a shortwave converter, I guess you would call it, in the car, because I like to listen to shortwave in the car. And I've had several radio units in the car that also picked up shortwave bands. I had to order one from, you may recall, there was a place in the UAE called Jackie's. And Jackie's, from Jackie's, I purchased I think it was a Sony car radio that got shortwave. I had that in the car for a while. And then the most recent unit I had in my car was, I think it was a Pioneer radio, if I'm not mistaken. I got it in Israel. I had it shipped from Israel, and it had shortwave bands. I've had several versions of shortwave radios in the car. Nowadays, you can get a lot of radio stations just from your cell phone via Bluetooth, but shortwave has always sort of been a part of, I guess, my identity.
Now, as a person who likes shortwave, and especially it sounds to me from the car, might actually even be interesting because the noise floor, at least in many residential areas, is so high that listening to shortwave may be difficult. But do you still listen to shortwave when you can? And are there as many stations on shortwave now, or are they different than they were before? It seems to me that VOA is almost out of business, or maybe they're operating on a reduced schedule. I think Kol Israel is gone, as are a lot of other shortwave broadcasters. What's left now?
That's right. You're absolutely right about that. I think there are fewer and fewer stations on shortwave today than there were certainly in the 60s, 70s, and even the 80s. A lot of the stations that are on now, I think, tend to be a lot of the more powerful stations that I can pick up appear to be stations in the United States that are mostly focused on, primarily focused on religious programming or political programming. It's much more difficult these days, I find, to be able to tune in on the shortwave bands, stations like Deutsche Welle, or even the BBC. It's quite difficult to find them now. I think with the advent of technology, a lot of the shortwave stations have sort of migrated to other means of communication. A lot of countries use different types of communication to get their messages out, which to me is sort of disappointing because I've always loved, trying to listen to these stations despite the crackle of static and fading and that kind of thing. To me, there was just always a thrill to listening to those stations. But you're right, they're sort of few and far between nowadays.
If we apply shortwave radio to the current present situation, we have a war in Ukraine between the Ukrainians and Russia. Has the Voice of America increased its transmitting capability into Russia during this period of time?
Well, I don't know the actual answer to that question. If they have, I have not been able to sort of find it on shortwave. I know for a while, and they may still be doing it, the BBC, I believe, restarted some of its shortwave broadcasts into that area in order to cover contemporary developments with respect to the war going on. But I think the VOA has sort of come to rely on other transmission modes and technologies and has sort of shied away from getting active again in shortwave.
That's very interesting. I'm just thinking that shortwave was kind of hard to block. If you were the Russians, receiving shortwave radio from outside the country was relatively hard to jam if it was moving around. So,
I agree. And there's a debate even today, I think, among some shortwave enthusiasts as to whether or not what we're seeing today in the world may or may not lead to a renaissance of shortwave broadcasting. I do believe that shortwave does have a role to play and can be a very useful medium for communicating messages. Nowadays, in our sort of internet-connected society, there may be simpler and cheaper ways, but they're also more susceptible, I believe, to deliberate disruption or blocking, jamming, what have you. So I am personally a little disappointed that shortwave has not had more of a renaissance, but hope springs eternal. One never knows.
That's exactly right. So how did this interest in shortwave radio, history, how did that affect the decisions that you made for your education and career?
Well, it's interesting. I think the ability to sort of learn about other cultures and languages via radio actually sparked my decision to choose a career in international affairs. I studied international relations in college at the University of Southern California, where I got my undergraduate degree. And then I got a graduate degree in foreign service from Georgetown University in Washington. My educational background led me to pursue a career in public service, first on Capitol Hill as a staffer on the House Armed Services Committee. Later, I became a political appointee in the George W. Bush administration, working at the Pentagon, and then most recently as Deputy Undersecretary of Defense in the Trump administration, a position that required Senate confirmation. And I have to tell you, without the influence of radio on my life, both shortwave and amateur, I don't think I would ever have chosen the career path I did. And I'll tell you one story. Back, I recall when I was a student at USC, one of the jobs I had was as a early morning newscaster on the school's radio station. I think it was KSCR. And I remember 8 o'clock in the morning, I would go into the recording studio and basically read 5 minutes worth of a news summary at the top of the hour. It wasn't much. It did not lead to a stellar career in radio broadcasting, but I thought that was one of the funnest things I had ever done.
As a student at USC, were you also a frequent eater at Tommy's?
Oh, funny you should mention that, Eric. I was. And in fact, my wife and I just got back a couple of weeks ago from a trip we took to Los Angeles, where I happened to take in one of the football games of my alma mater there. Fortunately, that was one that we won. And I said to her, "Why don't we go to Tommy's for a Tommy's burger?" And I can tell you, we didn't have time to do that on this trip, but I can tell you after all these decades, I can still taste what a Tommy's burger tastes like. I really can.
Just to tell the listeners and bring them up to date, Tommy's Burger in the middle of Los Angeles was a greasy spoon, and it served hamburgers with chili and onions. And if you were a college student anywhere in Southern California, I was at both UC Irvine and UC Santa Barbara, probably about the same time you were in college. And maybe we even probably shared a curb in front of Tommy's at some point.
Tommy's always had a line.
Tommy's had a line at 3 in the morning.
That's right.
In those days, if you're sitting in the computer center waiting for your turn on the terminal, or you've fed your cards into the system and you're going to wait 2 hours for the printout, you'd hop in your card and you'd drive 70 miles to Tommy's and get a Tommy's Burger with every other college student in Southern California at 2 in the morning.
It was great.
It was great. I guess that's part of the culture, college culture in those days.
And there are actually several now Tommy's restaurants sprinkled in various locations throughout Southern California.
But it's not the same.
No, absolutely not.
You could meet kids from UC Riverside or from Santa Barbara or whatever in the middle of the night, sitting on the curb.
Absolutely. It was just like a stand there. It was just like a hamburger stand.
That's right. There was no inside, as I recall.
That's right. There was no sit-down restaurant. And I believe it was on Beverly Boulevard in Los Angeles. And you're absolutely right, Eric. It was a great hangout place.
So after that, because you're in the Foreign Service and you spent your time on Capitol Hill, did you also spend any time abroad?
Well, I'm not actually in the Foreign Service. My degree was a master's degree in Foreign Service. That's what it was called at Georgetown. I was part of the Master of Science in Foreign Service program. So I was never actually in the Foreign Service, so to speak. Although I have traveled extensively around the world as part of my sort of government career, both when I was working on Capitol Hill and when I was working in the Pentagon.
And now this message from ICOM America. Heard it, worked it, logged it. This summer, keep your competitive contesting edge with ICOM. Our high-powered base stations cut through pile-ups, letting you work the bands and log those contacts. Contest from the comfort of your home or remotely with the RSBA1 app. The ICOM IC7851 gives you a new window into the RF world, and its on-air excellence is unparalleled. With faster processors, high input gain, high display resolution, and a cleaner signal, it's truly the pinnacle of HF perfection. Features include dual receivers, digital IF filters, memory keyer, digital voice recorder, high-resolution Spectrum waterfall display, enhanced PC connectivity, and an SD memory card slot. The ICOM IC7610 is the SDR every ham wants. This high-performance SDR can pick out faint signals in the presence of stronger adjacent signals. The ICOM IC7610 is a direct sampling software-defined radio that has changed the world's definition of an SDR transceiver. Its features include RF direct sampling system, 110 dB RMDR, independent dual receiver, and dual digicell. Create your own band openings with the ICOM IC9700. This transceiver brings direct sampling to the UHF-VHF weak signal world. This all-mode transceiver is loaded with innovative features that are sure to keep you busy that include faster processors, higher input gain, higher display resolution, and a cleaner signal. This has become the new de facto standard as a baseband rig for microwave operation as well. Features include 4.3-inch touchscreen color TFT LCD, real-time high-speed spectrum scope and waterfall display, smooth satellite operation with 99 satellite channels, dual watch operation, and full duplex operation in satellite mode. The ICOM IC7300 is a high-performance, innovative HF transceiver with a compact design that will far exceed expectations. This innovative HF transceiver digitizes RF before various receiver stages, reducing inherent noise in different IF stages. The IC7300 changed the way entry-level HF is designed. It is the go-to rig in my station now, and I love it. Features include RF direct sampling, 15 discrete bandpass filters, large 4.3-inch color touchscreen, real-time spectrum scope, and an SD memory card slot. Just know that you'll be very pleased with one of these fine rigs to enhance your contest, DX, and general ham radio operation in your station. Be sure to check out these ICOM rigs and their full line of base stations and portable radios at an amateur radio dealer near you. And when you make that purchase of a fine ICOM rig, be sure to tell your dealer that you heard about it here on the QSO Today podcast. And now back to our QSO Today. How did you get started in amateur radio?
My interest in ham radio was actually born years later, sort of out of necessity to solve a problem. Before mobile phones became ubiquitous, I was really looking for a way to communicate in an emergency while driving my daughter to daycare many miles from home. And I lived in the Washington, D.C. area and had to maneuver around the Washington Beltway. If any of your listeners are familiar with Washington Beltway traffic, you know that's often not a pleasure, especially in the wintertime when it's dark out in the early morning. So I decided I would get an amateur radio license, which I did. I got a Tech Plus license. And this was in the late 1980s, I think around 1989. And I joined one of the local amateur radio clubs so I could put a mobile 2-meter radio in the car and use the local repeater's auto patch function, if necessary, to make a phone call. It seemed like a great idea at the time and gave me peace of mind. That was sort of my initial foray into the world of amateur radio.
So what happened after that? You solved a problem by having this 2-meter radio in your car, but it seemed to have gone, based at least on the picture in QRZ, it's gone a lot farther than that.
Well, it has. I sort of have a before picture of my shack and an after picture of my shack. And you're right, the before picture of my shack has very few pictures of equipment in it. The after, which is sort of now, has a lot more. The first ham radio that I got was that 2-meter radio in the car. That was a Yaesu FT212RH. And I have to tell you, I still have that radio in my car. I've replaced my car, okay, but not the radio. The rig has lasted for decades. And since then, of course, I've acquired a lot of general coverage receivers, a few transceivers, as well as some other demodulating equipment for digital transmissions. For example, I've got an old, it may be in one of the pictures, I've got an old MBA reader by AEA, which was like a one-line scroll that could copy CW and RTTY. And I've got a larger universal M8000 communications terminal. I bought that decades ago. That was good for sort of decoding all kinds of digital communications, from fax to Olivia to MT63 and stuff like that. But nowadays, of course, computers and software can decode just about anything.
So you don't need all those special devices, but they're nice to have anyway to show people that come into the shack.
Absolutely. You know, I don't want to part with them. I may not use them. I'm sure they're probably still good in an operational state, but I just don't want to part with them. I've also got some of the old boat anchor general coverage receivers. I like some of the older radios. I've got a refurbished Holocrafters SX28, which is, I guess, a World War II type model, and I enjoy listening to that from time to time. I've got another old Holocrafters. I think it's the SX71 or 77. Can't remember what the nomenclature is for that. I've got a Hammerland HQ170, and of course I've got some older Panasonics and Sonys. You know, it's a collection that I enjoy having, even though I don't really have time to listen to all of them, but I just enjoy it.
What do you find about the older radios that might be different than the newer radios in terms of listening to them?
Well, I think for some, like for example, the Hallicrafters. When I listen to the SX28, and I have it hooked up to an older Hallicrafter speaker, it just seems that the tonal quality is just so rich compared to many of the newer, more modern radios. And you know, whether I'm listening to commentary or whether I'm listening to music, but especially music, it almost takes me back decades because the tonal quality that comes out of the radio and the speaker is such that I think it's incomparable. It's just amazing to listen to. And yes, you know, you can sort of adjust the treble and the bass like most radios, but I just find it unique. It's much different than any of the more modern receivers. And of course, some of those old receivers are based on vacuum tube technology. So they take a few seconds to sort of warm up, and sometimes there's an issue with frequency stability, but they're generally rock solid. When they're working well, they are rock solid receivers.
Do you also collect any old transmitters?
I don't have too many of the transmitters themselves. The first HF transceiver I had was also a Yaesu, and I tended to favor Yaesus in part because they seemed to be a little easier to modify for use with for Mars use, for use with the military auxiliary radio system. But the first HF transceiver I had was a Yaesu FT757 GX2 model, which I used for decades. I still have that. Unfortunately, it recently developed some frequency stability problems, and I had to break down and actually get a new HF transceiver.
And what is the new transceiver?
The new transceiver is also a Yaesu. It's an FT991A, which has a very nice color display, a waterfall display, touch screen, which really demonstrates how far the technology has advanced, which is sort of amazing to me. That was really the first new transceiver that I had purchased literally in decades, and I was just amazed at how much can be packed in such a small package. And with both the 757 and this 991, I've had the ability to really communicate around the world. And the interesting thing I found, Eric, is that the antenna I'm using is actually a G5RV that is literally wrapped around the beams of my attic. And because it's inside the house, it's invisible to the neighbors and the HOA. And I've been surprised at how well it works under less than optimal conditions. I've been able to make contact with stations on just about every continent and as far away as New Zealand and places like that.
What is the backstory on your call sign?
I was really thrilled when I got the call sign I got, N4WWL. And the reason I was thrilled is because I remember many years ago, my father was a great sports enthusiast. And as I said, we lived in Philadelphia, which is where I was born. We moved to the Maryland suburbs of Washington a number of years later, but I was still like in my teens. And I remember one night we were driving from seeing relatives in Philadelphia back home to the Maryland suburbs. And he had on the car radio, he was listening to a football game on radio station WWL in New Orleans, Louisiana. He was fixated on that because that was actually November 8th, 1970. And I remember that because the New Orleans Saints were playing the Detroit Lions. Tom Dempsey of the Saints kicked a 63-yard field goal, record-breaking field goal to win the game 19-17 over the Lions. And WWL was playing that game-winning kick over and over and over again. And I just remembered that. Yeah, it just seemed fascinating. And of course, on the East Coast in the evenings, DX is great. You can listen to stations almost anywhere, in the country. And when I got my call sign assigned from the FCC, it was N4WWL. And of course, the first thing I thought of was that football game, listening to it in the car on the radio station, WWL.
So it's serendipitous.
Absolutely. But, I've never wanted to change that call sign.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA3ON, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. Do you have a favorite operating mode?
Well, I guess my favorite operating mode, I'd have to say voice, mostly upper sideband. That's what's used for the Mars circuits. Although I have operated digitally and experimented a bit using MT63 and RTTY and Packet and other modes. But as an Air Force Mars member, I use the military standard digital mode called M110A for sending and receiving messages. I have to admit, I'm embarrassed to admit it, but I was never good at CW. But I admire those operators who are proficient in it. And for years, I kept a small laminated card with the Morse code alphabet on it in my wallet in the hope that I would magically become proficient in it by osmosis. But it didn't work. So I cheated and bought some electronic decoding equipment like the M8000 and the MBA reader that I mentioned previously. So at least I could copy CW.
Now, you've mentioned Air Force Mars. How did you become involved in Air Force Mars?
Well, I will tell you, I became involved based on some friends of mine in the local community. I was very fortunate to have several amateur radio operators living in my neighborhood that I heard on the radio. I'd listen to them on the 2-meter repeater in my car, and I sort of befriended them. They were overly generous in mentoring me and helping me, learning about radios and antennas and everything related. They also happened to be Air Force Mars members. One was Dennis Welch, call sign WB7VUM. He lived just down the street from me, as did another of my friends, Bill Conaway, W8HNT. And then I had a friend lived a little further out in Leesburg named Chuck Borgrink, W4LFO. And we would get together with other operators as part of a monthly breakfast group that our local our local Air Force Mars group put together. We met for breakfast every month for many, many years. Sadly, I have to say both Bill and Chuck are silent keys now, and Dennis now lives in Colorado. But I spoke to him several months ago, and was glad to have the opportunity to catch up with him. But they were the ones that initially got me interested, not only in learning more about amateur radio in general, but that sort of got me interested and involved in the Mars program.
When you think of Mars, I kind of think perhaps it's water under the bridge. Is it water under the bridge, or is it still quite active?
Well, it is quite active. There used to be Mars branches for three of the military services: the Army, the Navy, Marine Corps, and the Air Force. The Navy Marine Corps did away with its Mars program a number of years ago. There's some talk now about maybe possibly resuscitating it. So the Army and the Air Force are the two active military establishments that have Mars programs. You're absolutely right, though, Eric. The Mars mission has changed over the years. It started off as sort of a health, welfare, and morale type of public service in order to sort of communicate messages back and forth between armed forces members stationed abroad and their loved ones at home. Today, it's sort of morphed into an auxiliary capability for augmenting communications of the military in the event of disaster or something that disrupts or even destroys sort of the standard normal means of communications. And Mars operators participate in exercises exercises sponsored by, for example, U.S. Northcom, Northern Command, as part of their Defense Support of Civil Authorities mission. So it's basically focused on emergency preparedness and disaster relief nowadays in the event of a serious disruption in normal communications.
So was Mars involved in the latest Hurricane Ian, I think, in Florida?
Yes, I'm not sure whether Mars operators were involved. I know from time to time Mars operators have been involved in natural disasters like that. I remember, I think it was in 2010, when that massive hurricane struck the island of Haiti. We had several Mars operators actually go down to Haiti and set up communications there as Mars operators, which helped tremendously at the time. I was at the time I was asked by various Mars chiefs to sort of serve as the public relations liaison for the Mars program generally, to sort of put out the word in terms of what Mars operators were doing to help as a result of that natural disaster. When Superstorm Sandy hit the East Coast, the Northeast Coast, back in, I think, 2012, Mars operators were working with the National Guard in New York and elsewhere to try to establish reliable communications and help in the recovery effort as well. So there is a role, I think, for Mars to play in coordination with the National Guard and the active military in the event our communication services are required.
Maybe this is a loaded question. I apologize. Do you think that military operators have the same level of, radio operators have the same level of expertise that Mars operators with years and years of experience have?
Oh, that's not a loaded question at all. In fact, it's actually a great question. And I would say that for a while, the military operators, I don't think were as up to speed on HF propagation and how HF communications work as many of the Mars operators. I think when alternate means of communication became available, everything from satellites to email to the internet to the ubiquity of cell phones, HF communications sort of was not really pursued by the military as a viable alternate means of communication. But I have to tell you, I think in recent years that has changed. It's changed quite substantially. A number of Mars operators have been asked by various military units on various military bases for help with equipment and training in HF communications capability. And I think there's more of a recognition now, frankly, of the benefits that HF communications can provide as an auxiliary means of communication. And so I think we're really seeing more and more greater levels of interest among the armed forces, everyone from the National Guard to the active military in HF communications. And I think that's a positive trend.
I had read something 6-7 years ago that the Veterans Administration was going back to using HF to connect VA hospitals across America. Have you ever heard anything about that?
We may have read the same article because I remember seeing something like that as well. And I'll tell you, there are various federal agencies that do participate in something called the SHARES program, Shared Resources Program, that basically operates under the auspices of the Department of Homeland Security and uses HF communications. When shares nets have been activated on HF in response to various events or natural disasters or things like that, and it's a way of linking various HF communications among various federal entities. And Mars operators participate in that as well. So I do think there's a greater sense of the utility that HF radio can play now. For a while, I think it was just sort of almost a lost generation, if you will, when it comes to an understanding of high-frequency radio communications and the benefits that they could provide. Now I think the tide really is turning.
You gave a talk in 2016 at the Massanutten Amateur Radio Association, where you demonstrated expertise in the effects of EMP, or an electromagnetic pulse, and geomagnetic storms on the power grid. Can you explain what these terms are and how we might be affected by them, and what we could do as amateurs? Is there anything that we could do to our own infrastructure to prevent them from being destroyed by this phenomena?
I have to say I admire your research abilities. I'd almost forgotten about that presentation I gave. But you're right. One of the difficulties, of course, one of the challenges of operating HF is dependent on the atmosphere, on the ionosphere, and there has been a resurgence of interest, I have noticed, among amateur radio operators and Mars operators in the potential effects of electromagnetic pulse. Electromagnetic pulse is like a very, very short but intense pulse of electromagnetic activity, which has the capability of disrupting or destroying electronic equipment, especially more modern solid state equipment. And a number of radio amateurs have asked me, what causes this? It can be a natural event, like a huge solar flare, like the so-called Carrington event that took place in the 1800s. Or it could be a man-made event. Could be caused from a high-altitude detonation of, a nuclear weapon. But this electromagnetic pulse is extremely damaging to electronic equipment. And I was asked to sort of talk about this and to try to explain how radio amateurs can protect their equipment from these kinds of destructive pulses that can occur. And it's really difficult to do because, most radio amateurs are familiar with surge protectors and have things plugged into various surge protectors, which may be good for certain purposes, but they're not sufficient to protect against an electromagnetic pulse event. But unplugging equipment from your antenna can help. There is something that's called a Faraday cage, which is basically a box that you can, protected box that you can put your equipment in, seal it properly to protect from electromagnetic pulse effects. But these are all kinds of things that I think most radio amateurs don't do because it's a risk that is often not well understood or well appreciated. There are things that can be done, but they require, in some cases, some substantial effort.
Well, I myself actually have a rig or two in a discarded microwave oven with the cable, the power cable cut off because I found it by the trash can, the community trash can. I'm thinking that on the one hand, I have the radios. On the other hand, if the power grid is gone, if my solar charging system is gone, then I guess short of having a bicycle generator, I may be out of luck. What do you do, or do you do anything yourself to protect yourself against a geomagnetic storm or a solar flare or an EMP?
Well, I try to be cognizant of the possibility of those kinds of events. I have my equipment mostly hooked up, but I think I can relatively easily disconnect certain things. I also operate on battery backup power. So, I do have spare batteries in case the power grid does go down. That has happened actually more times than I like to count at my home QTH, only because when we get some very strong storms that pass through the area, we are susceptible to just losing electrical power where I am. And I have been able to operate in the past on battery backup power when the electrical grid has gone down.
Do you have a whole house battery backup system?
No, unfortunately, I don't. I don't. My neighbor does. He's got a generator. But since he installed the generator for his house, we haven't lost power. I think it's like one of those things where if you carry an umbrella with you, it probably won't rain. If you leave it at home, you'll probably get drenched. So
that may be true, actually. Fate is the hunter.
Absolutely.
We will return to our guests in just a moment. Nuts and Bolts Magazine is a new sponsor and is an amazing resource for new and old hams alike. Click on the banner to get your online or paper subscription of Nuts and Bolts. A new way to show your support of the QSO Today podcast is to buy me a coffee. I consume gallons of coffee to create this weekly podcast. Invite me for coffee by pushing the yellow button, Buy Me a Coffee, on the QSO Today show notes page. And now back to our QSO Today. What is shortwave consulting?
When I was working as an independent consultant, I went and registered my consultant organization with the state of Virginia, and I wanted to call it something, and I called it Shortwave Consulting. It's a sort of a national security consulting firm. I called it Shortwave Consulting because, as I said, my interest in national security and international affairs was sparked by my love of shortwave radio and by my initial foray into the radio universe. And so I thought that's an interesting, that's an interesting name. It's probably unique. And so I just called it Shortwave Consulting. It was sort of a one-man LLC, National Security Consulting Organization.
Is that what you're doing now?
Right now, I'm not doing independent consulting. Right now, I'm doing several things. I work for an organization called the National Institute for Public Policy, which deals with kind of high-level strategic issues that I used to deal with when I was in government and also in the private sector. It's a research institute, sort of a think tank, a nonprofit organization. And I do that. We put out various papers on strategic issues, nuclear weapons issues, missile defense issues, and the like. I also teach some graduate courses in defense policy and national security policy. One does deal with nuclear strategy, deterrence, and arms control issues, and another deals with the role of Congress in national security decision making. That has sort of been my professional, the way my professional career developed, I've been much more of a policy wonk, if you will, than a technical person, and that's why I've really been, I feel I'm really grateful to have had so many amateur radio and Mars colleagues that know so much more about the technical aspects of radio and transmission modes and antennas and things like that, that I've been able to rely on them. Although my professional career has taken me in a different direction, I really feel fortunate to have been able to rely on a lot of those people as my Elmers in the radio field.
Do you think that there's a place for the old-time radio experts in places like Washington, D.C.?
Oh, I absolutely do, because that's where you find, I think, some of the greatest minds and the greatest knowledge about radio communications. As I said, I think a lot has been lost in recent years with the advent of more advanced technologies. Technology is good. Don't get me wrong. And I was really surprised at how much the technology had advanced when I transitioned from my FT 757 to my 991A. It's amazing how far technology has come, but there are a lot of fundamentals also about propagation and about just HF in general that I think have tended to be lost in recent years with the growing popularity and ubiquity of alternate means of communication. I think a lot of the older Elmers and a lot of the older experts, and I do believe they're experts in radio communications, have a lot to offer the younger generation today in terms of their knowledge and experience on some of these methods of communication that I think in large measure have been forgotten or have not been pursued by younger folks.
Would you have some advice on how to perhaps bring younger folks into this sacred knowledge, if I could call it that? I mean, I somehow think that we're living in a science fiction story where we've created enough technology that there isn't anybody that actually knows how to fix it. You and I are talking on $1 trillion worth of infrastructure to have our conversation, whereas if we turn on the ham radios, we're working on $1,000 worth of infrastructure. So the nightmares I have is that we've created a society that's so highly technical there isn't anybody that can put it all right. There might be armies of people that can put it all right if those armies of people still exist after whatever event happens that perhaps makes that more difficult.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, if one of my Holocrafters receivers, needs a new tube, I can easily replace that vacuum tube. If my FT 991A goes belly up or needs some kind of a modification, everything today is so miniaturized and computerized that it's not really user friendly to do unless you have a great deal of expertise and confidence in your ability to repair something. But that said, I would still say to any young person who may be contemplating whether amateur radio is a useful hobby, I think ham radio has an awful lot offers an awful lot to explore. From just the thrill of hobbyists chatting with other hobbyists half a world away, to the opportunity to provide a public service through various amateur radio organizations, or to providing support to our military forces through things like the Mars program. There's literally something for everyone, I believe. And even though technology has advanced, there are changes in technology that have taken place that I think may help spark interest in amateur radio. For example, now there's a technology that allows me as an amateur radio operator to basically use voice over internet protocol, VoIP protocol, to pick up a telephone, a VoIP phone, to connect to other ham radio operators worldwide. There's a service called Ham Shack Hotline that allows that to take place. There are programs on the internet that actually simulate amateur radio, ham radio transmissions, where you can contact people via the internet, and it sounds as though you're actually communicating over HF radio. With all the static and the fading and all that, but it's actually over the internet. What I hope is that I hope these kinds of newer technologies will spark some additional interest, particularly among the younger generation, in actual ham radio and HF technologies, and help them to actually want to acquire an amateur radio license.
I think you answered a question that I had on my list here, and that is in the picture in QRZ, there's a Cisco VoIP phone sitting in your ham shack. Is that for your ham shack hotline?
Yes, sir, that is. You're absolutely correct. And, my extension is 5107. I don't know how many, I don't know what the total of amateur radio operators are that participate in this, but I can tell you I found it useful because I could pick up the phone, dial someone's extension, or get on a public chat room on the phone and get answers to technical questions from people that know much more than I do. So it's a tool like anything else, and I found it a very useful tool.
Well, I also have Ham Shack Hotline on my desk. Unfortunately, I think I used a telephone that wasn't on their list, so I'm on the experimental side. So while you have a beautiful 4-digit phone number, I think I have a 20-digit number with a lot of zeros in the middle.
Yes, there are a few of those indeed, but I think the network is growing. It's expanding. There are operators in Europe and Asia and sort of all over the place. Most, of course, are here in the United States. But again, it's a fascinating resource, I think, that puts people in touch with others who have been there, who have the expertise, the experience, and the knowledge to help. I just think this is a wonderful hobby, and to be able to do something with it, to be able to communicate literally halfway around the world or halfway around the neighborhood is without being tied to the internet or the power grid or what have you, is something that to me is almost magical.
Do you have a favorite amateur radio club?
I can't say I have a favorite amateur radio club. For a while, when I was in the earlier days, when I was using the auto patch function, there was a club here in Northern Virginia, the Northern Virginia FM Association. They operate a couple of repeaters here in the local area. There's a repeater that is further out that is used as a sort of a Skywarn, part of the Skywarn network, in the event of inclement weather, storms, what have you. I don't really have a favorite amateur radio club. And frankly, most of the time that I do have available, I try to spend on the Mars circuits, on the Mars network. For me, that's I see that as my ability to sort of give back to those who sort of sacrifice for us and sort of stand on the front lines for us.
Are you operating Maritime Mobile?
I am not, but I wish I was. I do have a boat that is docked on the Potomac River here in the D.C. area. Perhaps not surprisingly, I have named her Shortwaver. And one of my goals, while I do have a shortwave radio and old Sony on board, one of my goals has been to try to hook up some kind of an HF radio on the actual boat. I haven't been able to do that yet. It's still on my to-do list, but I would love to operate maritime mobile cruising up and down the Potomac River.
Well, I saw the picture, and a bayliner doesn't have a mast, so it would be hard to load a backstay on a bayliner.
Indeed. It would be a definite challenge, which is sort of what's deterred me to, up until now, from actually doing it. Obviously, there's a maritime VHF radio on board. I would just love to be able to check into a net every once in a while, maritime mobile.
What do you think the greatest challenge is facing amateur radio now?
Oh, the greatest challenge. I think the greatest challenge is, frankly, maintaining a level of interest among young people. Technology today may make amateur radio seem antiquated to some, but I really do think technology can also fuel greater interest in the hobby, as radios pack such a great amount of technology in smaller packages and can do a lot more than ever before. I know, for example, I have two grown children, and my daughter especially sort of laughs at me, when she comes and home and she looks at my shack and all the radios in there, and she says, "Dad, what do you need all these radios for?" And I try to explain it to her, and she says, "Yeah, but I can do all that on my cell phone." and to an extent, that's true. She can. But who do you think the first person is she complains to when for some reason her cell phone service drops? It's me. And so I think the biggest challenge facing amateur radio today is maintaining that level of interest among young people and helping them understand the utility and the benefits that amateur radio brings community-wide. At a local level, even at a state level, and at a national and international level. There really is something for everyone, and trying to convince people that they can enjoy amateur radio, and there are all kinds of ways to do it, all kinds of modes for transmitting, all kinds of activities, and all kinds of clubs. I think it's just generating an understanding of that that is. In my view, perhaps the biggest challenge that amateur radio faces today.
And what most excites you about amateur radio?
I think the variety of equipment and operating modes available to the operator. And, of course, the opportunity to meet new people daily on any given day, at any given time. You can generally fire up the rig and communicate with someone. It may be someone around the block, or it may be someone around the world. Yeah, to me, that's the exciting part of amateur radio. The ability to communicate with people that, heretofore have been unknown to you, but now can become friends via radio. That's the great thing.
And what advice would you give to newer returning hams to the hobby?
I think learn as much as you can about the various aspects of the hobby, not just the radios themselves, but learn as much as you can about the nuances and vagaries of propagation, of antennas, how they work, which are best. There are so many aspects to the hobby that I think are important to know about. I guess the single best piece of advice I would give to newer returning ham radio operators is learn as much as you can. I don't know what I don't know, but I do know there's a lot I don't know, and I wish I knew more. And I've been fortunate to be able to tap into those people who know much more than me. And that's helped me in my journey. The advice I would give to others is tap into Elmers and mentors and those who came before who know so much more, and learn from them, because I don't think you can go wrong by doing that. Not at all.
David, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. This was really interesting for me, and I know that listeners will also find it interesting. With that, I want to wish you 73.
73, Eric. I appreciate it very much.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with David. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in N4WWL in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to ICOM America for their continued support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of this fine sponsor by clicking on their link in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, click on the transcribe button at the top of the show notes page. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. By using the Amazon link on the home page before you shop at Amazon allows Amazon to send us a small commission on what you purchase that further keeps our QSO Today project going. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as we work towards episode 500. QSO Today is now available on a large number of podcast players and now a host of podcast services and applications. We are Podcast 2.0 compatible. I now use the Fountain podcast player to listen to all of my favorite podcasts. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.